Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. This is part 1 of What If Naruto Traveled Back in Time. Before we start, please do support for more awesome content, it really means a lot. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a like. And also check the description for the creator of this great fanfic, and support them for making this fanfic. So let's start this video. Blood. He could smell it everywhere. On him, on the burning buildings around him, leaking out of the body of the last of his childhood friends not far from him. It was even in the mud that he was lying in. Something cold and wet hit his face, causing him to stir and beginning to bring him back to his senses. Was it raining too? He couldn't remember when it had started. It was strange, even the rain seemed to smell of blood, though that was impossible. Or at least improbable. He could smell the fire too. The burnt stench of wood slowly being reduced to ash, a hint of sulfur being carried in the smoke as the buildings, walls, and even citizens of his village burned around him. Slowly he became aware of the sounds reaching his ears. The creaking of the buildings as their support beams burned away. And more weight was placed on boards and beams that weren't meant to hold so much. The pitter-patter of rain. Or blood. Sprinkling down from the heavens and landing in the puddles made in the small potholes of the road. The cries and screams of those watching their friends, family members, or even complete strangers being massacred. The battle cries of their enemies who had at long last overrun them. A rasping sound that he couldn't immediately identify until he realized that it was the sound of his own breath laboriously being pushed in and out of punctured lungs, carrying the scent of still more blood to his nose, as it pushed against the mud on his face. And the laughing. As much as he hated the other sounds, it was the laughing that he hated the most. It mocked him for his failures that day and in days past. The sound of his friend's laughter coming out in a manner that Sasuke had never used before. Though it was little more than a whisper, it roared in his ears, drowning out everything else. Kukuku. It wasn't even a real laugh, he realized, just a sound of amusement. A sound that was designed to make those who heard it realize that they were hopelessly outmatched, and that their enemy didn't even feel it was worth the trouble of actually laughing at their wasted efforts. To let them know that they would soon die, just as their friends had, just as their teachers had, just as hundreds, maybe even thousands, had before them. Lying broken and defeated at the feet of Orochimaru. Slowly Naruto lifted his head from the mud, spitting blood from his swollen lips, and pushed his long blonde hair away from his face, so he could look at the snake-like eyes peering down at him from Sasuke's face. Orochimaru in Sasuke's body was a horror that even his most terrifying nightmares couldn't eclipse. Perhaps it seemed even worse because for a short while he'd been allowed to believe that it wouldn't happen, as he'd spent years fearing it would. He thought that Sasuke had defeated the Sannin, that the danger had passed, but like a parasite Orochimaru was lying dormant within the Uchiha, slowly gaining more and more power until he was ready to take over, and when he was, it happened almost instantly. One day there were reports that Sasuke had taken over the sound and was searching for Akatsuki. Or at least Itachi. And the next thing he knew Orochimaru had miraculously returned. He thought that he might get his friend back, that Sasuke and he would meet up in their search for Itachi, and while they did meet, Sasuke was even more changed than he'd been during the previous attempt to rescue him. He led his own team now, for his own reasons, and he didn't want anything to do with his friends from the past. He eluded them that day, disappearing while they were distracted by other battles, and by the news that Jiraiya had been killed. Itachi was found dead in a long-forgotten Uchiha hideout, his eyes plucked out of his skull, and Naruto had hoped, that Sasuke would return to them, that having accomplished his goal of killing his brother, he'd come back to rebuild his clan. It didn't happen. Naruto never found out if it was the Orochimaru-infected Kabuto who managed to transfer the Sannin into Sasuke's body, or if Orochimaru himself was still alive inside of Sasuke after their battle. But news soon trickled out of the rice country that Orochimaru had returned, and that he now possessed the body of the last known Uchiha. After that, it wasn't long before Orochimaru and the Sound began to use his new body to take over several countries. They made treaties with stronger, but just as ambitious, countries, attacking mutual enemies until the Sound was strong enough to break the treaty, or had found another country to ally with, and then turn on their former allies. In just a few short years, the map of the continent had been redrawn, with the once small rice country now dominating the majority of the continent. Conventional wisdom was that it would take Orochimaru years to consolidate his power within his enlarged country, that the ninja of the other nations would rebel against him, so that he was forced to constantly put down new rebellions, but conventional wisdom didn't seem to apply to Orochimaru. The ninja of the conquered were all too happy to accept their new leader and their new title of Sound Nin. Because of this, his forces only seemed to grow stronger the more he used them. No nation was safe, but Konoha had always been the real target, and had always known it. Perhaps, had it not been for Akatsuki and the more immediate threat they posed, Konoha could have used a preemptive attack against Orochimaru to save themselves, or at least concentrated on preparing for the war that they could see coming. Unfortunately, they didn't have the manpower to fight the shadowy organization that threatened the world and Orochimaru and his allies. By the time Akatsuki was dealt with, the sound was too strong to attack directly, and all of their attempts to prepare for the war served merely to delay the inevitable. As the sound's power grew, the leaf shrank until it was nothing but a shadow of his former self. Soon the sound had the power to crush Orochimaru's village of birth, but it waited until its victory was absolutely assured. The Sannin had learned from past mistakes. He took no ally with him when he finally attacked the Fire Country. He relied on none but his own followers and his own power. Naruto knew that Konoha's ninja were better trained and generally more powerful than their sound counterparts, but they were not nearly numerous enough to pull out a miraculous victory. It was because of this that he had hunted down the body of his former friend amongst the burning ruins of the village he loved. He knew he had to cut off the head so that the body would die. But after nearly 20 minutes of fighting, it had become clear that it wasn't going to happen. Naruto had long since learned that good didn't always triumph over evil, and that even when it did, the price was often almost more than he could bear. It was hard to say when he'd let go of his childish assumptions of how the world worked, or of his belief that if he just tried hard enough he could do anything. Probably it had started with Jiraiya's death, or maybe it even went back to the day when Sasuke left the village. Somewhere in there, he had to grow up and see just how terrible and frightening a world he really lived in. Even with those losses, he tried to push through, of course, but it grew harder and harder. As his friends were needed on more and more dangerous missions, the odds began to catch up with them, and there seemed to be nothing he could do to hold on to them. The seeming inevitability of his precious people's deaths was a hard thing to accept, and it only got harder as the body count piled up. They weighed on him day and night, and the faces of those he'd lost haunted his dreams, until he was only a shadow of the young man he'd once been. The hardest of all of them, the one that really left him broken, wasn't one of the first or the latest, but she was definitely the most important. Sakura, his best friend, his teammate, perhaps the only woman he'd ever really loved, died in his arms after a failed mission to kill the body that had once belonged to their best friend, and in a way, Naruto died with her. He'd never forgiven himself for it, and never really gotten over it, despite the best efforts of his surviving friends. And then they too began to be killed. Sometimes it was in a large battle, other times it was just on a simple mission. They died protecting him, they died because of missions he assigned to them, they died because of missions they took despite his efforts to keep them away from danger. And on top of all that, the village that he loved so much was also dying. The battles, the wars, the sneak attacks, they all took their toll on the once beautiful and peaceful village. He wouldn't be able to save it, just as he hadn't been able to save Sasuke or Sakura or any of the others. Now, the one chiefly responsible for all those losses and thousands more, was merely staring down at him with a fond expression that seemed misplaced on Sasuke's face, as he watched Naruto pull himself up from the muck, all the while making that annoying sound. Kukuku, shut up, Naruto growled as he wearily brought his hands up in front of him, while blood-red mud dripped from them. He could feel the Kyubi's power welling up inside of him, begging to be released, but he refused to give in to it. The fox's power was a double-edged sword, and in a fight like this, he couldn't afford to lose control. Kyubi would give him power, but he wouldn't be able to think anymore, and he wasn't so sure even Kyubi's power would even the playing field. At least not a semi-controllable amount of Kyubi's power. He supposed he could let the demon out completely. That would at least slow Orochimaru down, but Kyubi would destroy the village anyway, so nothing would be gained. You've lost, Naruto-kun, Sasuke's voice chuckled. Just give up, and I'll make your death quick. If there was any of Sasuke left in there, you'd know I don't do that, Naruto growled, hoping that he wasn't lying. Look around you, Orochimaru laughed, waving a hand at the burning buildings, and the dead bodies all around them. You still want to be Hokage. You still think you can be Hokage. By the end of the day, there wouldn't be a village left to be Hokage of. There are more important things than being Hokage, Naruto countered with more confidence than he actually felt. Once I've killed you, it won't matter that you tried to burn the village to the ground. Konoha will live on, the spirit of fire will keep burning. The Sannin shook his head, and ran a hand through his long, dark hair, brushing it away from his face. As his head rolled lazily to the side and his lips curled upward in a mocking smile. You're just as naive as Jiraiya was. Naruto tensed at the mention of his dead teacher and friend. Orochimaru's yellow, snake-like eyes grew hard as they focused in on the blonde ninja. I'll show you how wrong you are, just as I showed him. He closed his eyes for the briefest of seconds and whispered, Sharingan. When he opened them again they were the color of blood, and the oh-so-familiar three-tomo could clearly be seen, even from a distance. For a moment, Naruto was back at the Valley of the End, trying to stop his friend from going to Orochimaru. Until he tapped into Kyubi's powers, he'd been helpless against Sasuke's eyes then. There was only one way to defeat a Sharingan user, and that was through speed. The amount of insight the bloodline limit gave his users was unbelievable, but speed countered it. If you were faster than the one using the Sharingan, you could still win. Naruto was fast. He was incredibly fast. But he was not faster than Orochimaru, not enough to beat a Sharingan anyway. The fight had been over before, now it was, whatever came after, over. Naruto's only option was to use Kyubi, to hell with the dangers and the consequences. His mind would no longer be clear once he allowed the demon's chakra into his system. Techniques would be thrown by the wayside in favor of animal instincts. And the demon would hunger for more and more control, until it had completely taken over. Once he started down that path, he would keep going until only death surrounded him, or something snapped him out of it. He'd come close to killing friends while in that state. He had ripped Jiraiya's chest open and thought nothing of it, but his friends were all gone, his village was falling apart around him, and he was surrounded by enemies. Perhaps it was time to let the monster within him out to play. You look scared, Naruto-kun, the snake Sanin taunted, but you don't know fear, not yet. My Sharingan hasn't gotten to the scary part yet. Orochimaru slowly brought his hands up in front of his face, pinky and ring fingers laced together, middle fingers raised and pressing against each other, with his index fingers bent, touching tip to tip. His hands remained like that for only a second, and Naruto knew it was just long enough to draw more chakra to his eyes. He'd seen that movement done dozens of times in the past. Mangekyu Sharingan. In an instant, Naruto's eyes were on Orochimaru's feet. He faced Itachi and Madara. He knew what the Mangekyu was capable of, and he couldn't help but smile. There was still a chance to win, and he might not even need Kyubi to pull it out. The Mangekyu Sharingan was immensely powerful, but it took even more power to use it. It wrecked the user's eyesight, and depleted chakra reserves at an astonishing rate. He picked Kakashi up off the ground often enough to know that if Orochimaru was going to use such a wasteful move against someone who knew how to fight it, there was still a chance. What are you looking at, Naruto-kun? Sasuke's voice with Orochimaru's accent sassed. There's no need to look away, it's always better to see your death coming. Or so I would imagine. You're forgetting who beat Madara, Naruto countered. I know how to fight the Mangekyo Sharingan. Tobi was no longer the person he'd once been, but I suppose I should thank you for that, Orochimaru chuckled. Had it not been for you and your friend's efforts, Akatsuki might have made things difficult for me. Of course, I managed to beat Itachi for you, so I'd call us even. You didn't beat Itachi, Sasuke did, Naruto snapped back. He didn't need your help to do it either, he would have gotten there by himself if he'd stayed with his friends. Orochimaru smirked and shook his head. I'm Sasuke and Sasuke is me. We killed Itachi. Even as he fought him, Sasuke could feel me growing inside of him, becoming stronger and stronger, reaching the point where I would take control. But that hardly matters now, does it? Let's stop worrying about the past, because I've already killed you. Your past, your future, they're gone, because looking down doesn't save you from this Sharingan, just as it didn't save Deidara's arm when he fought you and my little tool Kakashi. In spite of himself, Naruto's eyes flickered up to Orochimaru's, and then he couldn't look away. The three Tomo had become three sickles, connecting where the Sanin's pupil had once been. Naruto had seen this variation of the Mangekyu Sharingan before as well, but it had only been used on enemies of the leaf. It was Kakashi's ultimate trump card. The world around him suddenly seemed to melt, as if it had been nothing more than a chalk painting on the sidewalk that was now being washed away by the rain. Naruto tried to back away, tried to move in any direction, but his feet refused to respond. The world around him was all bleeding towards him, the bodies on the ground, the mud, the rain, the burning buildings, all of it was collapsing in on him. There really was only one chance now, only one possible thing that could turn the fight around. It would be his final attack, because he would be no more once it was done, but perhaps it would be worth it. Orochimaru could not be allowed to survive. The sound could not be allowed to continue to subjugate the rest of the continent. Anything was better than letting that happen. Anything. Naruto could feel the demon now, deep inside him, howling to be released. All it took was a simple closing of his eyes, and he was back in the darkened tunnel, standing in the knee-deep water before the huge gate. It was hard to be sure, but Naruto thought Kyubi almost looked pleased to see him after so many years of being studiously ignored. No words passed between them, the demon simply smiled as Naruto hung his head, and stepped up to the bars. His trembling hand reached up and grabbed the seal upon the cage and pulled it away. There was an awful cry of delight from within the cage, as the doors burst open and Kyubi stepped out, finally free. Naruto didn't even flinch as the two giant paws closed around him. Now you will see true power, the demon promised. Naruto's eyes fluttered open as he awakened in the real world. He could already feel his body and mind detaching from each other, as the demon within him began to take control. Perhaps it was because the seal was no more, or maybe it was a side effect of the Mangekyo Sharingan, but he could feel everything that was happening to his body with perfect clarity. Orochimaru's attack was now crushing and pulling his body apart, as the vortex sucked him ever deeper within it. For a brief second, he thought it was the most painful thing he'd ever experienced. And then Kyubi's chakra exploded from within him, and he found out just how wrong he'd been. Naruto threw his head back and screamed, as every muscle in his body simultaneously contracted with such force that he heard his own spine snap only to instantly heal. His whisker marks grew whiter and darker. As the brilliant blue drained from his eyes and was replaced by the deepest of reds, his canines lengthened and sliced into his swollen lips, drawing a stream of blood that fell from his face, and was caught up in the vortex and swirled around him like a halo. Red chakra blazed thickly around him, forming a second skin that burned his body. As his scream died, his breath came out in short, quick gasps, with low growls interrupting every few seconds. "You're too late," Orochimaru taunted. "You should have let the Kyubi out earlier because at this point you're already dead." Kyubi Naruto knew he was right. They were already trapped in the dimensional rift, from which escape was impossible. The Jinchuriki snarled and threw his hand forward, as the vortex swallowed him up and collapsed, but the clawed chakra hand of the Kyubi continued forward even as Orochimaru's attack finished its work. The Sanin's eyes widened for just a moment, and then the claws sank into them. Through the tiny pinprick of the real world that he could still see, Naruto saw Orochimaru fall to his knees, clutching at his eyes and screaming in pain and anger. The red chakra wavered and then vanished as the vortex expanded outward uncontrolled, swallowing even the last of the great Sanin. When Kakashi had used the Mangekyu Sharingan, he'd been able to precisely aim and contain the space-time warp, but Orochimaru seemed to be out of control. Or maybe it was simply that from inside the vortex everything seemed to be collapsing in on him. There was no way to know, and it didn't really matter anymore. It's not fair, Naruto thought, not even finding it odd, that he was once again in control of his body and mind. As he watched Sasuke's body twist and deform, it shouldn't have been this way. If I had just done things differently, none of this would have happened. It was so easy to look back, to remember those times when things were simpler, and to see all of those unknowing mistakes that would eventually become the problems that destroyed his village. His eyes began to glaze over, as images passed in front of them, battles against the sound, meetings with the village council, watching Hinata's marriage, the losses of his friends, the death of Sakura, destroying Akatsuki, fighting Itachi. From there the images began to move faster than his mind could keep up with. He managed to make out the fight against the immortal Akatsuki members, and then meeting Sai for the first time, training with Jiraiya, meeting Tsunade, the Forest of Death, the Wave Country. And finally the day he'd been placed on Team 7. He wished he could start over again, to grab that young idiot posturing and boasting by the ear, and knock some sense into him, to be more of a friend to everyone around him from the get-go, to not waste time thinking about how amazing he was, especially since he wasn't. But there was no time for that. It was the past, it was out of reach. And then, everything went black as Naruto's body was torn to shreds by the gravitational pull of the vortex. Once more, Orochimaru had come out on top. It had long been known among the Hokage's guards that Uzumaki Naruto suffered from nightmares, and that rushing into the office every time he cried out in terror would only wear you out and earn you a frightening glare. One that was even worse than the glare they received if they accidentally called him Hokage-sama. Most ninja had nightmares at some point. It was impossible to see and do the things that they were occasionally required to do without being affected in some way, but Naruto's seemed more persistent than was usual. Konohamaru, when he thought Naruto was out of earshot, had theorized that the loss of so many friends had a more powerful effect on Naruto, because he had gone so long without them as a child. He and others had heard Naruto proclaim that he would protect his precious people often enough to know how important it was to the village leader, and it seemed clear to him that when Naruto inevitably hadn't been able to protect everyone, it had wounded him in a place that wouldn't heal quickly, if ever. Naruto had overheard those comments, and had informed Konohamaru that if he had time to discuss another person's dreams, which were not really as bad as everyone tried to claim, perhaps he should be given a few extra missions. It was on one of those extra missions that Konohamaru and his team had been ambushed and Naruto's brilliant blue eyes snapped open, and then instantly shut again. As he moaned in protest over the brightness of the room, and the immense headache that erupted the moment he became fully aware of what was going on around him. "Damn Sakaba," the blonde groaned. "He knows he's supposed to cut me off before I get too drunk." His voice sounded strange in his ears, more high-pitched than he was used to, but he brushed it off as the lingering influences of the sake, and tried to sit up. For some reason he'd put more strength into the movement than he'd intended, and ended up nearly smashing his face into his knees. How much did that bastard let me drink last night? He wondered as he slowly opened his eyes once more and tried to acclimate them to the light. As the blurry shapes around him slowly came into focus, his eyes widened in alarm, and then promptly snapped shut against the pain from the light. Where the hell was he? If he'd ended up in some barmaid's room, he was going to be really pissed, which was funny when he thought about it, because getting pissed was probably what got him into this position in the first place. If Jiraiya were still alive, he'd be laughing his ass off at his poor student. Of course, that would be preferable to what Sakura would have done to him if she wasn't. Naruto ruthlessly squashed that train of thought, and opened his eyes again. He had more important things to think about than the ghosts of the past. With another groan he reached up to brush his long blonde hair back, but instead punched himself in the eye. Damn it, he grumbled as the blow seemed to double the headache he was already suffering through. With his hand on his face, it was easy just to slide it up to his hair, but what he found there shocked him even more than his lack of coordination. Normally his hair hung down around his shoulders, its natural spikiness remaining, but losing the battle against gravity. As he'd started letting it grow, Sakura had commented that he looked good with longer hair, and so he kept it even when it started to annoy him. This morning, however, it was short again, very short. He probably hadn't had hair this length since before he'd gone off to train with Jiraiya. What sort of sick bastard cuts a man's hair while he's sleeping? Naruto wondered, and then an even more troubling thought struck him. What sort of confident, sick bastard cuts the most powerful ninja in the village's hair while he's sleeping? Naruto could count the number of people who could get away with something like this on one finger, and she'd never do anything like that even if she thought he was letting it get a little too long. Hinata just wasn't that sort of person. Kiba might have done it before well, back then Kiba wasn't exactly one to talk about keeping one's hair trimmed anyway. With a sigh, Naruto waved his hand through the air, as if warding of the spirits of the dead, and then looked around the sparsely decorated room. It didn't look like the sort of room a barmaid would keep, but perhaps he was seriously overestimating her. The bland, whitish-colored paint was chipped and peeling off the wall, though it looked like someone had attempted to cover up the worst of it with either glue or tape. Of course, taping paint to a wall didn't really seem to help too much, but he couldn't deny that an effort had been made to make the place look almost nice. A wasted effort, but an effort nonetheless. There was a small, half-dead plant that was either recovering from near death or heading towards it, and had probably been pulled out of a dumpster at some point, given the condition of the pot it was resting in. A few ramen posters decorated the walls along with little scrolls, upon which random slogans were drawn in sloppy, almost illegible kanji, no doubt covering up more peeling paint. Naruto had had a few such ramen posters on his own walls as a child, and knew that they were free, if you sent in enough proofs of purchase to different ramen companies, which meant that whoever had brought him here at least had good taste, and maybe even some extra ramen they'd be willing to part with. He sighed at the nostalgic thought of ramen. It had been so long since he'd last enjoyed a nice steaming bowl of his favorite food. As his mouth watered with the memory, his eyes shifted to the window and his heart nearly stopped. Where was he? The view from the window was of a peaceful village in the middle of a normal day. It looked sort of the way Konoha once had, years and years ago. Actually, Naruto thought as he leaned towards the window and stared in awe at the world outside, it looks a lot like Konoha used to. He watched for a moment longer, and then turned his attention back to the room, his eyes suddenly alert, and the pain from his headache pushed into the back of his mind. Something was wrong. This room felt extremely familiar, but at the same time felt misplaced, as if he wasn't supposed to be there. At that moment he heard a door open in an adjoining room and the sounds of footsteps entering. In an instant he had thrown the sheets covering him aside and was reaching for a weapon as he jumped out of bed. Or at least tried to. Instead, he ended up falling flat on his face, when his feet didn't hit the ground, when they were supposed to. Crap, he grumbled as he rolled onto his back, and tried to rub his nose, only to hit himself in the mouth as he once again failed to properly move his limbs. It was quickly becoming apparent that he'd been drugged, or had some sort of nerve damage that Kyubi's healing powers weren't feeling up to fixing. Had he been attacked by some enemy the previous night when he was staggering home after leaving the bar? Had he been kidnapped somehow? Those ideas seemed incredibly unlikely. The village council had assigned Anbu members to watch over him when he left the Hokage Tower. Despite his objections to the precautions, and even drunk, he would have been more than a match for the majority of people who'd like to kill him. He was the strongest person in the village, unofficially the Hokage, the leader of the village, no matter how much the council hated to admit it, and arguably stronger than any other official Hokage that had come before him. Why did he need guards? The council, however, had insisted, pointing out that he could be removed from his position, which Naruto highly doubted, if he refused to cooperate with those charged with running the village, namely, them. It was moments like those where he truly understood why Tsunade Bachin had been so reluctant to take the name Hokage, and why Jiraiya had outright refused it. And those two hadn't even had to deal with a council full of people that still hated them for something sealed in their bodies when they were babies. Hinata chided him when he said it out loud, but he longed for the day when the older generation finally died out, so his few surviving peers, who accepted him for who he was, could take over the council positions. He strained his ears, and remained perfectly still on the floor, listening for any sound that would tell him if his captors had heard him, but their faint conversation continued without pause. With a grunt of unexpected exertion, Naruto sat up and slowly climbed to his feet, still wondering why his body felt so strange. Sai and Shikamaru would probably have told him that he'd be better off staying in bed than letting whoever was out there come to him. Actually, Sai would have asked something stupid like whether or not Naruto still had balls, and Shikamaru would have rolled his eyes and muttered troublesome if they were still around, but they hadn't been for a long time. So Naruto was free to do whatever he wanted without being criticized for it. If the voices belonged to enemies, they weren't going to stay out there forever without checking up on him, and if they were friends, it would be better to meet them standing up than lying on the floor. He'd never had a lot of patience and he hated looking weak in front of others, so he was going to go and see what was going on, and either kick someone's ass for cutting his hair, or kick someone's ass for kidnapping him, and cutting his hair. As he pulled himself up to his full height, he again felt like something was off. The whole room seemed to be set up as an optical illusion because he felt shorter than he knew he was when he looked around. Either that or the room had been made for a very tall person with everything proportioned for his added height. Doing something like that seemed a pointless waste of energy to Naruto, since it was just as easy to duck one's head, but who was he to criticize the eccentricities of others? He carefully shuffled his feet across the floor heading towards the door, and hoping to avoid another fall, until his body began acting normal again. When he reached the doorway, he grabbed the handle that was at mid-chest level, when it felt like it should have been closer to his waist, but as he started to turn it, the voices on the other side began to speak again. And this time he could actually make out what they were saying. "So, this is Naruto's house, huh?" A lazy, slightly muffled voice asked. Naruto's breath caught in his throat, causing him to cough as he swallowed badly. He knew that voice, and it wasn't supposed to be a voice that was around anymore. Kakashi had been dead for almost a decade. The blonde ninja's jaw flexed as he squashed the emotions trying to rise up within him. It was probably just his ears playing tricks on him. The voices were coming through a door, and possibly through masks as well. There was no reason to imitate Kakashi since Naruto knew without a shadow of a doubt that his former mentor was dead. He'd been the one who killed him, after all. "He's a moron, but I think giving him to you is best. You have a good nose for these types." The second voice seemed familiar as well, but Naruto couldn't think of where he'd heard it before, if he ever had. Regardless, these two were underestimating him, thinking he could just be handed over to someone like it was nothing. They were about to see that even with his body drugged or injured, Uzumaki Naruto was no one to be trifled with. "Plus you." Naruto turned the handle and pushed the door open, his muscles already tensing as they prepared to launch him either at his attackers or behind some cover, if anything was thrown at him. "Alright you bastards, just what?" His voice died on his lips as he caught sight of the bastards who were both staring at him, as if he were the strangest thing they'd ever seen. One was older, with wizened features and a grey goatee. The finely carved wooden pipe that he had probably been smoking was hanging precariously from his open mouth, a thin trail of smoke still rising from it. Most importantly, he was dressed in the white and red robes and hat of the Hokage of Konohagakure. The other was a tall, slender man wearing a green chunin vest, a dark blue mask covering his face, and a head eye over one eye, while his silvery hair stood almost straight up in defiance of gravity. Naruto knew that the man's one visible eye was normally only half open, as though it was too much work to open it the rest of the way. At the moment, however, it was nearly 3/4 of the way open in his mild surprise. They looked exactly like two men that Naruto held in supreme regard. Two men who had helped shape the man Naruto had become. Two men who were most definitely dead. Naruto's butt hit the ground hard as his legs gave out and his breath caught in his throat. What is this?" Naruto, the man who looked like the third, asked in the gruff, gravely voice that the elderly occasionally gained as they aged. He rescued his pipe just as it started to fall from his mouth and then asked, "What are you doing here? You're supposed to be. What the hell is going on?" Naruto yelled louder as his feet pushed against the worn wooden floor, sliding him back into the room he'd come from until his back hit the bed, and even then his feet kept moving in an attempt to put as much distance between himself and the ghosts as possible, even if it meant driving him through solid objects. "Naruto, what's wrong?" the old man asked, his gray eyes now filled with concern. The man who looked like Kakashi had stopped watching Naruto, and instead began wandering the small kitchen space, even taking a peek inside a refrigerator that looked like it had seen better days, and not any time recently either. Naruto could only stare up at the old man's face and wonder. He'd never seen such a perfect reproduction of another person without anything to base it on. Whoever these guys were, they were good. They even had the 2 liver spots on the third's left cheek in the right places. Naruto knew every detail of the third's old, wrinkled face. He spent countless hours staring up at it, while sitting at his desk pretending to do paperwork, and the face he was looking at right now was so flawless it had to be a jutsu of some sort. "Is this a genjutsu?" Naruto asked in a voice that he hoped sounded more confident than he felt. "Genjutsu?" The old man laughed. "Naruto, you aren't making any sense. You're supposed to be in class right now getting your team assignments. What are you doing sleeping in so late on today of all days?" Naruto scowled and brought 2 fingers up in front of his chest as his other hand closed around them. "You're right," he hissed, "and I suppose I'm just some little genin who should go hurrying off to the academy, so Ruka-sensei doesn't get mad at me, right?" He felt his considerably large chakra reserves well up within him on command, and pushed it out as he called out, "Release." The man pretending to be the third's eyebrows rose until they vanished under his hat, as the wisps of smoke curling out of his pipe drifted away from the blonde with the expulsion of energy, and were momentarily trapped under the Hokage's hat. "Naruto," he growled, his voice suddenly very serious, "get a hold of yourself. You are in a genjutsu and you are a genin who better hurry up and get to class before Ruka gets mad at you." After what the two of you went through the other day, I'd have thought you'd be a little more considerate towards his feelings. Naruto wasn't listening. He was still too caught up in the surprise that he hadn't been able to break free of the genjutsu. It was possible, he supposed, that he wasn't stuck in a jutsu, but instead that these two men were playing some other sort of trick on him, somehow disguising themselves as the third and Kakashi, or maybe the genjutsu user was just extremely good. What do you want with me? Naruto demanded at last, swallowing the confusion that he'd felt when he'd first set eyes upon them. Konoha won't negotiate with you, and they won't pay any sort of ransom, even if you... Shut up, Naruto, the old man groaned as he rubbed his forehead with his hand, momentarily pushing back his hat and revealing another perfectly placed liver spot that was not always visible. I know you're not the third, so you can stop pretending, Naruto shot back. The third's been dead for years. If you wanted to try something like this, you should have disguised yourself as TS. Naruto was unable to finish his last line, as the old man burst into laughter. Dead, you say? He chuckled merrily. My boy, 69 might seem old to one so young, but it's not that old. I've still got a few more years left in me, I think. Excuse me, Kakashi's voice asked as his head peeked through the doorway into the bedroom. Have you been drinking this? He held up a milk carton with a picture of a black and white cow on it, and gave it a little shake. Liquid could be heard sloshing back and forth within, along with the sounds of more solid pieces hitting the cardboard walls. Naruto stared at the image of his old sensei in confusion, while the pretend Hokage nodded his head in understanding. Naruto, you had a bad dream last night, that's all, the old man said with a kind smile. When you put that sort of thing in your body right before you go to sleep, it's bound to give you unsettling dreams. Or the runs, Kakashi added offhandedly as he headed back to the kitchen to return the expired milk to the refrigerator. It wasn't a dream, Naruto insisted. I'm the Hokage, well, the temporary Hokage anyway, and you were dead. Naruto, there's no such thing as a temporary Hokage, the old man pointed out. You're either Hokage or you aren't. But I know it seemed real to you, and it probably didn't help that you woke up to strange voices in your home, but it was only a dream. Now go get dressed and Kakashi-sensei here will take you to meet your teammates. Naruto looked from the face of the third to Kakashi, and then back again, trying to think of something to say, but instead found himself rising to his feet and nodding. The third smiled at him and stepped out of the room, quietly closing the door behind him. Through the door Naruto heard him say, not quite the way I expected you to meet him, but that's Naruto for you. Kakashi's response was unintelligible, but it was just as well. Naruto had other things to worry about, like trying to figure out what the hell was going on, and who those two men were, because they weren't Sarutobi Hiruzen and Hatake Kakashi. He was sure of that much, at least. Naruto sat down on the bed and looked around. Now that he sort of knew what game was going on, he had to admit that the room did look a lot like the bedroom of his old apartment. The posters were right. The half-dead plant was about where he remembered Mr. Aki being until he nursed it back to health, and given it to Kakashi, to add a little color to his sensei's apartment, and the view from the window was good enough that Naruto couldn't see any differences. After deciding that there weren't going to be any mistakes that he could spot just by looking hard enough, he stumbled over to a beat-up dresser that was even missing the front right corner like his hat following a mishap dragging it up to the apartment from the dumpster in a back alley not too far from where he had lived. Inside he found a single orange jacket with a white collar and blue panels on the shoulders and upper chest, 2 pairs of orange pants, and 4 dark blue shirts. They were exactly what he'd worn when he was younger. They wouldn't fit now, of course, but he had to be impressed by the level of detail this genjutsu or masquerade was showing. Whoever was behind this had gotten the third down perfectly, and had almost gotten Kakashi right as well, except that they'd made him much too tall. They had his room right, and also his clothing, but while they could reproduce a room, or two and maybe a few people, they couldn't change the fact that Naruto had grown over 30 centimeters, and gained about 25 kilograms in the 15 plus years that separated him from his 12-year-old self. The jacket and pants wouldn't fit him now. Naruto slowly reached down, and touched the clothing, smiling at the wave of nostalgia that overtook him as he felt the worn cloth under his fingertips. And then, slowly his smile dropped to a frown as he stared at his hand. It looked strange for some reason. It was small and smooth, like the hand of a child. He flexed his fingers experimentally, squeezing the jacket under them, just to make sure they were really his, and then hurried towards the bathroom, stumbling and falling into the wall twice before finally arriving. As with everything else, his bathroom had been reproduced well enough that he couldn't see any mistakes. The mirror was cracked, and one of the handles on the faucet was missing. The rusted drain in the sink didn't have a stopper anymore, though there clearly was supposed to be one. His old toothbrush, or at least what looked like his old toothbrush, was sitting on the edge of the sink, as if it had been hurriedly thrown down while he ran off to class, and the tube of toothpaste was missing its lid, leaving a crusty mess around the opening. Naruto's gaze, however, was fixed on the mirror or, more accurately, on the face staring out of the mirror. It was him as he'd been years and years ago. The image wasn't of an adult or even of himself after he trained with Jiraiya, it was that of a child. The boy in the mirror's eyes whitened in terror as he stared at Naruto, and his hand slowly reached up and touched his face just as Naruto's did the same. Naruto nearly cried out in alarm, but quickly bit down on his tongue before he could make a sound. The last thing he needed now was to have the old man pretending to be the third come rushing in to make fun of him some more. He couldn't lose his head over this. He had to think and figure out what was going on. He was in a genjutsu, he was sure of it now. No amount of makeup or costumes could produce this sort of effect, and any henge placed on him would have been dispelled when he tried to release the genjutsu earlier. Was this Yajaku no Jutsu, then? Or maybe some other genjutsu he'd never heard of before? Yajaku was used to retrieve memories in greater detail than the conscious mind could normally produce, and it didn't seem likely that it was what Naruto was under. He'd never used it himself, but he'd be under the hypnosis technique once or twice, and it hadn't felt like this. Those times he'd recounted a few difficult to recall memories with perfect clarity, not made up something completely new. He'd also been aware of the fact that he was speaking and telling those around him what he was seeing in his mind. That wasn't happening here. Naruto slowly sank to the floor, ran his fingers through his short, spiky blonde hair, and blew out a calming breath, but didn't feel much calmer for it. He closed his eyes and drew in another deep breath as he tried to think. Something must have happened to him the previous night. Had he actually gone out drinking like he'd originally thought, or had something else happened? It took him a moment, but then he remembered that Hinata had come by the day before delivering a message from her husband, the leader of the Hyuga clan, requesting a meeting last night, and Naruto had been forced to accept. Much as he hated to admit it, he needed the damn Hyuga clan in general and their leader in particular to remain happy in order to fight the enemy outside the gates, without worrying about the ones inside. The leader of the clan, Hyuga Hiroshi, Hinata's husband. Though Naruto hated to think of the man as such, was politically savvy, and always looking to scoot up a few notches on the totem pole of power, usually by knocking someone else down a few pegs. Had Hiroshi done this to him somehow? Naruto didn't think it was likely. He knew the man disliked him, and the feeling was more than reciprocated on Naruto's side, but Hiroshi was a coward who would never do something like this. He might hit and belittle his wife, who was willing to put up with the abuse for the good of her clan. Even when Naruto told her nothing good was coming from what was happening to her. But he wouldn't attack the de facto leader of the village, no matter how much he might like to. No, he would try to whittle away at Naruto's support amongst the village council. As if he really had any to begin with. And look forward to the day when the war with the sound ended, and he could politically stab Naruto in the back. Hiroshi wasn't stupid, nor was he particularly brave in real combat unless someone was watching. Something like this was beyond him. Naruto frowned thoughtfully. Had he even met with the bastard the previous night? No, something else had happened. A battle? Yes, that was it. Naruto had fought someone, while Konoha was burning around him. He gasped as the memory of the pinwheel pupil and Tomo of Orochimaru's Mangekyu Sharingan flashed in front of his eyes. So that's it, huh? This isn't Yajaku no Jutsu, it is Tsukiyomi, Naruto thought dejectedly. He'd only gone through both Madara's and Itachi's Tsukiyomi once or twice each, but that was more than plenty as far as he was concerned. And also more than most anyone else had lived through to his knowledge. The genjutsu created by the Mangekyu Sharingan was arguably the most powerful in the world. Once you saw that Sharingan, you were trapped in the jutsu, until either the user ran out of chakra or got bored of torturing you. Unfortunately, days could seem to pass inside the technique, while only a few seconds of real time slipped by, so running out of chakra wasn't much of a problem, and Orochimaru enjoyed torturing people far too much to get bored of it anytime soon. This was far different from what he'd seen the last time he was trapped. At that time, Madara had made it seem that Naruto was being mauled by something that looked like Kyubi over and over for a week, the sequence always starting over just as he felt himself about to die. The sky and moon had been red then, and the world around him had been strangely colored as well, whereas here he was seeing things that looked completely and totally natural. Other times things had appeared to be normal, but usually something horrible happened that quickly clued him into the fact that things were not normal, like his skin melting or turning into Sasuke, with his curse seal activated. But so far, other than appearing to be younger and meeting up with two people who were definitely dead, nothing too strange was happening to him. He certainly wasn't being attacked at all. Were it not for the fact that he could remember being older, this illusion would have seemed completely real, and he might have just gotten dressed and headed off to the academy to get his team assignments. Had Orochimaru really advanced this maturity? Were even his Uchiha techniques so far beyond Itachi's, and Madara's as to make the previous two strongest living Uchihas look like children who were only pretending to be a ninja? Naruto shook his head and opened his blue eyes, staring unseeingly up at a crack on the ceiling. If Orochimaru was that powerful, there was no way anyone would stand a chance against him. Konoha would be destroyed, or perhaps more destroyed, was a more accurate way of putting it. The only thing he could do when he awoke from this would be to either fight Orochimaru in an attempt to give any surviving ninja and villagers a chance to flee, or to simply unseal the Kyubi, and accept the consequences that would come with that. Kyubi could possibly kill Orochimaru, but he'd probably kill everyone else as well. Either way, they were all dead. At least Kyubi would kill them quickly, and might not hunt every last one of them down, and slaughter them. If he knew Onsajisausai no Jutsu, he could try to use that. Though the Sharingan would probably see what he was trying to do the moment he started to make his move. But it didn't matter because Orochimaru and Ankh were the only two who knew the suicide technique from what Naruto had heard. Ankh had taken its secret to her grave, and Orochimaru was possibly even less likely to tell him how to do it than she was. With a nearly overwhelming sense of hopelessness, Naruto rose to his feet, stumbled over to the dresser, and got dressed as quickly as possible. He smiled weakly down at what looked like the hit Iruka had given him when he first graduated and then tied it around his head, using it to hold his bangs away from his eyes. The torture would no doubt start soon, and he planned on taking it like a true leaf nin, and then when it was over he was going to unleash hell on his enemy, and everyone else. With one last sigh, Naruto worked his way over to the door, still struggling to control his body, and went out to see the imaginary ghosts that had probably been sent to begin his torture. Hatake Kakashi did not like children on a normal basis, and as they made their way through the winding dirt streets of Konoha, he was growing ever more certain that, despite the boy's parentage, he was especially going to dislike Uzumaki Naruto. He wasn't normally the sort to jump to conclusions so quickly, but in this case he couldn't deny what his gut was telling him. The boy had started out interesting enough, skipping his last class of the year, missing team assignments, and then practically attacking the Hokage of all people, was enough to get Kakashi to pay some attention to him, but it had really been all downhill from there. After they had left Naruto's apartment, they had hit the main street which would lead them almost straight to the academy. Naruto had followed quietly behind him, except when he would inexplicably stumble or trip over his own feet. The Hokage had said the boy was a bit of a moron, but Kakashi wasn't sure how Naruto had managed to live 12 whole years, without learning how to put one foot in front of the other properly. It was as if he was trying to take larger steps than his legs were capable of, and his arms were swinging awkwardly at his sides. The first few people they passed had started to smile as they saw them, or more accurately, they had smiled at Kakashi. Then Naruto had tripped or fallen, and alerted them to his presence, at which point their eyes had become cold, and their smiles had fallen. The first time this had happened, Naruto had looked shocked, and more than a little hurt, as if he were expecting a totally different reaction, but then he'd skulled his face, firmly placed his eyes straight ahead, and then promptly tripped, and fell on his face. This, naturally, but not necessarily fairly, had earned him some cruel laughter from those around him as he tried to pick himself off the ground. After a while, Kakashi had decided to take a side route to save Naruto from any more taunts, and also to see what his reaction would be. He couldn't officially consider it a test, but he was curious as to how Naruto, who was almost legendary for his disregard for any and all authority, would react. Kakashi disliked people who followed their leaders regardless of how idiotic their decisions were, the sort of person he'd been when he was Naruto's age, and figured that Naruto probably stood a better chance of restoring his faith in fresh from the Academy Genin than anyone else on his team. Sadly, Naruto had looked confused, but then shrugged and followed at his potential instructor's feet like an obedient little puppy. If he were allowed to, Kakashi might have failed him right then. He almost considered asking why Naruto didn't bother to point out that they were taking the long route, but before he could, Naruto tripped and ended up head down in a trash can that he'd unsuccessfully attempted to sidestep, his feet kicking back and forth in a desperate and futile attempt to free himself. Kakashi grabbed the blonde ninja by his ankle and lifted him straight out of the refuse, wrinkling his nose under his mask at the stench that came with the boy. Part of Naruto's face was now covered in some sort of green muck that had probably been there for longer than it should have, and a banana peel had managed to get stuck on his hit eye. The white collar of his orange jacket as well as half of his head were soaked in an unidentifiable yellow liquid, and the moment he was dropped unceremoniously on the ground, he fished something out of one of his sleeve and tossed it back at the trash can, missing horribly. Kakashi glanced down at the object and rolled his eyes. It was a large, overflowing diaper. That was uncalled for, Naruto grumbled as he spit some of the green, smelly slime from his mouth and looked up at the sky in annoyance. Kakashi thought about letting his young charge go home and change, but after Naruto's failure to even make a peep about the long cut they were currently taking, he decided to let the boy suffer for the moment. The meeting wouldn't be that long, and a ninja needed to learn to deal with all sorts of hardships, not that Naruto or anyone on his team was likely to become a ninja anyway. "Come on, we don't want to be late," Kakashi said in a cheerful voice. "Yes, sensei, that's clearly something you're worried about," Naruto replied, earning himself a few points without even meaning to, though the way he said sensei left something to be desired. Kakashi wanted people who would think for themselves, not someone who disrespected his leaders. "We'll take the roofs, that way you won't cause too much of a scene." "Whatever." Kakashi gave Naruto a slightly sour look, and then leapt onto a nearby balcony, before bouncing up onto the rooftops above them. Naruto tried to follow him, but overshot the balcony horribly, crashing through a window and into someone's apartment. A second later there was a loud scream, and the sounds of a struggle, and then Naruto hurried back through the window, tripped, and fell back down to earth, landing on his back in a cloud of dust with a thud. Kakashi's head hit his hand as he stared down at the clumsy boy. "Why don't you just get there when you can?" he suggested. Naruto's response was not something that a 12-year-old should have ever heard, let alone be willing to repeat, and the hand gesture that accompanied it didn't help matters much. "Watch out for trash cans," the Jounin offered helpfully before leaping away, quickly heading in the direction of the academy. "Ew." Naruto scowled and closed his eyes, doing his best to ignore the stench that covered him, and made his eyes sting and water. This was probably the most idiotic genjutsu he'd ever heard of, as well as the most detailed. He'd seen villagers along the road that he hadn't seen in years, but still recognized on sight. The baker who used to yell at him when he put his hands on the fresh baked bread and sniffed them lustfully, the old woman who spit in his direction almost every morning, the kids who were 4 or 5 years younger than him and had played silly games with him until their parents warned them to keep away from him. All of them were perfect. He'd never seen anything like it. It was as if he'd literally been transported back in time. He'd heard of and even been trapped in detailed jutsu before, but never anything at this level. Even though he was an evil, psychopathic, murdering bastard, Orochimaru really was amazing. Naruto suspected that at least part of the man's skill stemmed from Sasuke's own prodigious talents. If Sasuke had just stuck around, and not betrayed the village, he would no doubt have eventually avenged his clan, but now he was nothing more than a tool for the snake Sannin, a container to be used up, and then tossed aside, when it was no longer useful. Naruto couldn't help but wonder if there was enough of Sasuke left in there to regret the fact that he would never resurrect his clan. The second part of his ambition. With a groan, Naruto rolled himself into a sitting position and stood up. He still couldn't control his body very well in this jutsu, and it was beginning to get annoying. He just wasn't used to being so short and weighing so little. When he mistimed his jump, it had been because he pushed too much chakra into his legs, and his numerous trips were due, at least in part, to him being used to longer legs. When he'd gone to step around the trash can, he'd assumed that one step would get him fully around it. Instead, it had left him only halfway there, and as he'd attempted to shift his body to avoid smashing into it, he'd again misjudged his size and had lost his balance. It seemed that Orochimaru was planning on using his Mangekyu Sharingan to embarrass Naruto to death. Not exactly what Naruto would have pictured the evil bastard who had practically taken over the entire world to do with one of the ultimate bloodline abilities, but then it was hard to understand the mind of someone like Orochimaru. It seemed out of character, but Naruto was looking at the evidence, and he couldn't deny what was happening to him. He reached up and wiped more of the green slime away from his mouth, further staining his jacket, and then got to his feet and slowly made his way towards the academy, trying to carefully control his movements, and also watching for the sneak attack that would probably be coming at any moment. Thanks for listening. If you want the next part of this video, like, subscribe, and comment down below, and turn on that bell notification, and also check out the playlist that I have created, and enjoy. Link is in the description. See you in the next video. Peace.